So, this book, The Borrowers Afloat, is the third book in a series of 5 books. We have The Borrowers Aloft and The Borrowers Avenged next. But first, we're almost through with The Borrowers Afloat. So if you guys want to start getting those others, The Borrowers Aloft is book number 4, and The Borrowers Avenged is book number 5, which I might not be able to read. The Borrowers Avenged, we'll have to see. Anyway, let's go ahead, and we are on chapter 12 of The Borrowers Afloat. So if you guys would grab your copy of the book, like, share, and subscribe, we'll go ahead and get started on it. Spiller, they saw, to control them on a shorter length, was rolling up the tow line. Not that tow line was quite the right expression under the circumstances. The drain ran ahead of a slight downwards incline, and Spiller functioned more as a sea anchor and used the twine as a brake. "Here we go," said Pod. He gave the lid a slight push. They slid ahead of the slippery scum, to be lightly checked by Spiller. The candlelight danced and shivered on the arched roof and about the dripping walls. So thick and soapy was the scum on which they rode that Pod behind them seemed more to be leading his bundle than dragging it behind him. Sometimes, even, as it seemed to be leading him. "Whoa there!" he would cry on such occasions. He was in very good spirits, and had been, Arrietty noticed, from the moment he set foot in the drain. She, too, felt strangely happy. Here they were, the two she held most dear, with Spiller added, making their way toward the dawn. The drain held no fears for Arrietty, leading, as it did, toward a life to be lived away from the dust and candlelight of confining shadows. A life on which the sun would shine by day and the moon by night. She twisted round her seat in order to see ahead, and as she did so, a great aperture opened to her left, and the dank draught flattened the flame of her candle. She shielded it quickly with her hand, and humbly did the same. "That's where the pipe from the sink comes in," said Spiller, "and the overflow from the copper." There were other openings as they went along, drains that branched into darkness and ran away uphill. Where these joined the main drain, a curious collection of flotsam and jetsam piled up, over which they had to drag the soap lid. Arrietty and Hummely got out for this to make less weight for the men. Spiller knew all these drains by name, and the exact position of each cottage or house concerned. Arrietty began at last to understand the vast resources of Spiller's trading. "Not that you get up into all of them," he explained. "I don't mind an S-ben, but where you get an S-ben, you're apt to get a brass grill or such like in a plug hole." Once he said, jerking his head toward the mouth of a circular cavern, "Holmcroft. That is, nothing but bathwater from now on." And indeed this cavern, as they slid past it, had looked cleaner than most. A shining cream-colored porcelain, and the air from that point onwards, Arrietty noticed, smelled far less strongly of tea leaves. Every now and again they came across small branches of ash or holly, rammed so securely into place that they would have difficulty maneuvering round them. They were set, Arrietty noticed, at almost regular intervals. "I can't think of how these tree things get down drains anyway," Homily exclaimed irritably when, for the 5th time, the soapbox lid was turned up sideways and eased past, and she and Arrietty stood ankle-deep in jetsam, shielding their dips with their hands. "I put 'em there," said Spiller, holding the boat for them to get in again. The drain, at this point, dropped more steeply. As Homily stepped on opposite Arietti. The soapbox lid suddenly slid away, dragging Spiller after. He slipped and skidded on the surface of the mud, but miraculously he kept his balance. They fetched up in a tangle against the trunk of one of Spiller's tree-like erections, and Arietti's dip went overboard. "So that's what they're for," exclaimed Homily, as she coaxed her own flattened wick back to brightness to give Arietti a light. But Spiller did not answer straight away. He pushed past the obstruction as they waited for Pod to catch up. He said suddenly, "Could be." Pod looked weary when he came up to them. He was panting a little, and had stripped off his jacket and slung it round his shoulders. "The last lap's always the longest," he pointed out. "Would you care for a ride on the lid?" asked Homily. "Do, Pod." "No, I'm better walking," said Pod. "Then give me your jacket," said Homily. She folded it gently across her knees and patted it soberly, as though it were tired, like Pod. And then they were off again. An endless, monotonous vista of circular walls. Arietti, after a while, began to doze. She slid forward against the egg, her head caught up on one knee. Just before she fell asleep, she felt Homily slide the dip from her drooping fingers and wrap her round with Pod's coat. When she woke, the scene was much the same. Shadows sliding and flickering on the wet ceiling. Spiller's narrow face palely lit as he trudged along. And the bulky shape beyond that was Pod. Her mother, across the egg, smiled at her bewilderment. "Forgotten where you were?" asked Homily. Arietti nodded. Her mother held a dip in either hand, and the wax, Arietti noticed, had burned very low. "Must be nearly morning," Arietti remarked. She still felt very sleepy. "Shouldn't wonder," said Homily. The walls slid by, unbroken except for arch-like thickenings at regular intervals, where one length of pipe joined another. And when they spoke, their voices echoed hollowly back and forth along the tunnel. "Aren't there any more branch drains?" Arietti asked after a moment. Spiller shook his head. "No more now. Holmcroft was the last. But that was ages ago. We must be nearly there." "Getting on," said Spiller. Arietti shivered and drew Pod's cloak more tightly around her shoulders. The air seemed fresher suddenly, and curiously free from smell. Or perhaps, she thought, we've grown more used to it. There was no sound except for the whispering slide of the soapbox lid and the regular plop and suction of Pod and Spiller's footsteps. But the slit seemed rather thinner. There was an occasional grating sound below the base of the tin lid, as though it rode on grit. Spiller stood still. "Listen," he said. They were all quiet, but could hear nothing except Pod's breathing and a faint musical drip somewhere just ahead of them. "Better push on," said Homily suddenly, breaking the tension. "These dips aren't going to last forever." "Quiet!" cried Spiller again. And then they heard a faint drumming sound, hardly more than a vibration. "Whatever is it?" asked Homily. "Can only be Holmcroft," said Spiller. He stood rigid, with one hand raised, listening intently. "But," he said, turning to Pod, "whoever'd be having a bath at this time of night?" Pod shook his head. "It's morning by now," he said. "Must be getting on for 6. The drumming sound grew louder, less regular, more like a leaping and a banging. "We've got to run for it," cried Spiller. Towline in hand, he swung the tin lid round, and taking the lead, flew ahead into the tunnel. Arietti and Homily banged and rattled behind them, dragging in a short line. They swung, shatteringly thrown from wall to wall, but panic-stricken at the thought of total darkness. Each shielded the flame of her candle. Homily stretched out a free hand to Pod, who caught hold of it just as the bundle bore down on him, knocking him over. He fell across it, still gripping Homilly's hand, and was carried swiftly along. "Out and up!" cried Spiller from the shadows ahead, and they saw the glistening twigs wedged tautly against the roof. "Let the traps go!" he was shouting. "Come on, climb!" They each seized a branch and swung themselves up, and wedged themselves tight against the ceiling. The overturned dips lay guttering in the tin lid, and the air was filled with the sound of galloping water. In the jerking light from the dips, they saw the first pearly bubbles and the racing, dancing, silvery bulk ahead. And then all was choking, swirling, scented darkness. After the first few panic-stricken seconds, Arrietty found she could breathe, and that the sticks still had. A mill race of hot-scented water swirled through her clothes, piling against her at one moment, falling away the next. Sometimes it bounced above her shoulders, drenching her face and hair. At others, it swirled steadily above her wrists and tugged at her legs and feet. "Hold on!" shouted Pod above the turmoil. "Die down soon," shouted Spiller. "You there, Arrietty?" gasped Homily. They were all there, and all breathing, and even as they realized this, the water began to drop and level, and less swiftly. Without the brightness of the dips, the darkness about them seemed less opaque, as though a silvery haze rose from the water itself, which seemed now to be running well below them. And from the sound of it, as innocent and steady as a brook. After a while they climbed down into it, and felt a smoothly running warmth around their ankles. At this level, they could see a faint translucent where the surface of the water met the blackness of the walls. "Seems lighter," said Pod wonderingly. He seemed to perceive some shifting in the darkness where Spiller splashed and probed. "Anything there?" he asked. "Not a thing," said Spiller. Their baggage had disappeared, egg, soapbox lid, and all, swept away in the flood. "And now what?" asked Pod dismally. But Spiller seemed quite unworried. "Pick it up later," he said. "Nothing to hurt. And saves carting." Homily was sniffing the air. "Sandalwood!" she exclaimed suddenly to Arrietty. "Your father's favorite soap." But Arrietty, her hand on a twig to steady herself against the warm flowing ebbing past her ankles, did not reply. She was staring straight ahead, down the incline of the drain. A bead of light hung in the darkness. For a moment she thought that, by some miraculous chance, it might be one of the dips. Then she saw it was completely round and curiously steady, and mingled with the scent of saddlewood, she smelled another smell. Minty, grassy, mildly earthy. "It was dawn," she announced in a wondering voice. "And what's more," she went on, staring spellbound at the distant pearl of light, "that's the end of the drain." So this whole episode, or this whole chapter 12, has been their path down this drain, their exit from the sealed house into what is going to be their new adventure. So I wonder what's going to happen. I mean, we know kind of what A, B, C has to be. But what does the interim have to be? What is all the little adventures that they have? Because, I mean, we knew they had to get through the drain. But we didn't know the drain. We didn't know how the drain was, or how long the drain was, or how many things were attached to this drain. There are so many things yet to be discovered if at first we take that first step. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me on this wonderful, wonderful book that Mary Norton has given. And you all have a wonderful and blessed day.